So, good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Dr. Rajesh. I am working as a Senior Regional Director at IGNOR Rail Center, Trivandrum. Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I can see.
Good afternoon, sir. You're well audible.
Yeah. Could you kindly introduce yourselves before we start? Good to know each other. Unitan, sir?
Yeah. Myself, G.S. Unnithan. I am from Adur.
Okay.
I am a retired person. I retired as General Manager of Canara Bank.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Nice.
So I may be the senior most student of this section, perhaps. I don't know. But still, out of my interest, I thought I will take up this course and do whatever I can, including the assignments, etc.
Yeah, great to meet you, and it is always an inspiration to have people like you with us, because you
Thank you,
carry
sir.
with you so much of experience in the relevant field.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so
Which
much.
program have you joined? Because we have this paper commonly in 3 or 4 programs.
Yeah. This is, I have joined for that environmental.
A postgraduate diploma in environmental and sustainable
Yes,
development.
PGDESD.
Okay, great. Nice meeting you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Ajmal Mohammed.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Myself Ajmal. I'm from Kollam.
Oh, great.
I'm a safety professional working in Ita Gelatin India Limited.
Okay,
I have overall 15 years of experience. So I
wonderful.
have joined for this PGDESD, same program.
Yeah, nice meeting you.
Yes, sir.
I hope we can have a good deal of discussions among each other. Arya, am I audible?
Sir,
Yeah. Where are you from?
I'm Alappuzha Manar.
Okay, great. You are joined for PGDESD?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I feel we can start. In fact, this MED008 is quite a long paper, because it has 4 modules and a lot of discussion. And many of the areas are related to international relations. Some of it is related to domestic environmentalism. So it is a wide mix of aspects that we have in MED008. We'll begin with a short presentation. You can interrupt me whenever you want, ask your doubts, put your suggestions and queries as and when you like. So please don't feel hesitant in interrupting me at any point in time. I'll just mount my presentation. I hope the slide is visible to you. Can anyone confirm?
Yes, it is
Yes,
visible.
sir. Yes, sir. It is
Thank
visible.
you. Thank you. Okay, so let's begin with this. What is this? Obviously, a silly question, but what do you make out of this picture?
It's a burger.
It's a burger, but it signifies something more than a burger. If you link it with culture, what would you say? Is it just a burger? It is part of a certain country's culture, isn't it? Cuisine is obviously part of culture. So if you look
Yes.
at the American continent, the US, burger has in fact become sort of a part of their culture. So basically, when you look at a burger, you will find that it is part of a culture which embodies it. And today, the fact is that this burger has taken itself across the world. You go to any country, whether in a KFC or in a domestic shop, or even in a McDonald's, you will definitely find this burger. So, burger, frankly speaking, has globalized itself. Wherever you go into go across the world, you will find that this burger has globalized itself. It is an indicator of globalization in one form or the other. So when I say this, what is globalization according to you? What is globalization?
Making it available in any part of the world.
Yeah. So what are the manifestations of globalization?
Availability locally.
Availability. One is goods and services are available throughout the world. When you
Yes.
talk of culture,
Yeah.
when a certain culture becomes paramount and it's found in every part of the world, then you say that the culture itself has got globalized. For example, the Hollywood films. Anywhere across the world you go, the Hollywood film, you will find that one or the other theater is in fact showing a Hollywood film. So Hollywood films have also globalized itself, and that's part of the culture. So globalization, we can say, is any activity or phenomenon that becomes international by having an influence on a large number of nations. So when we talk about globalization, it can be economic globalization, cultural globalization, political globalization, etc. Can you give me an example of political globalization? For example, the concept of democracy, isn't it? The concept of democracy today
Yeah.
has moved across the globe. It's earlier it used to be it used to be found only in certain isolated pockets, but today democracy is considered as a universal phenomenon. So we can say that political democracy has globalized itself. Now, when we talk about globalization per se, we'll find that there are various phases of globalization. If you look at the period from 1860 to 1940, that is considered to be the first phase of globalization. This is considered as the imperialist colonialist phase, where the Western European countries, they used to subjugate countries like India and South Asian and Asian countries and establish their hegemony. And once they established their hegemony, what they used to do was something simple. They used to transport all their products, which was produced in surplus in those countries, to these countries and got it marketed here. So their products, in one way or the other, got globalized. And on the other hand, the raw materials and other things from the colonies were transported back to their factories for the production process to begin. Now, that was the first phase in which many countries were controlled and subjugated. Now, in the period 1950 to 1980, you find that gradually this imperialism is coming to an end in the political sense. There was the end of colonialism and the welfare state capital system came into existence. Now, in that phase, also you will find that the Western European countries now changed the pattern of colonialism. Now, earlier, it was political subjugation which was there, but now their economic power was so rampant that across the world they could easily send their products, they could easily control other countries as well. And the third phase is what we are in currently, that is from 1980s to present. Now, in this period, we will find that there is a strengthening of regional integration agreement. Now, what is meant by regional integration agreement? Any one of you? Can you give me an example?
This Asian countries agreement.
Yeah, you have SARC, SAPTA, then
Yes.
European Union is there. So regional integration took place in a great deal. Now, when the countries of a region integrate, what usually happens is that there is a blockage of exports from other countries into this block, whereas export and import within this regional block expands. For example, when the European Union became a reality, third world countries often used to find it very difficult to export their products onto the European Union. Whereas within the European Union, the countries eliminated trading restrictions and also tariffs were lowered. So regional integration led to globalization within a particular region, whereas countries outside that region found it extremely difficult to sell their products in these countries. And another important element that led to the emergence of globalization in this period was the emergence of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization has a primary objective of cutting down trade barriers. Now, before the World Trade Organization came into existence, there was something called the GATT rounds. The GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And every few years, you had a GATT round where liberalization of service exports or goods exports would be discussed, and gradually they will decide whether to cut down on tariffs, non-tariff barrier, etc. So the 80s till the present stage, you find that there are two phenomena happening simultaneously. One is that regional integration agreements are becoming very, very prominent. And if you look at the current state also, India is now planning to sign a free trade agreement with many European countries separately, Norway, Sweden, even with Great Britain. So that all shows that there is an integration across the board and within regions taking place. And secondly, the emergence of WTO has worked towards strengthening the trade regime by lowering the tariffs as well as non-tariffs. Now, what are the key factors which led to the emergence of globalization? One is technology. Now, if you look at the world, the years like 1800 and so on, transport used to be a very difficult proposition. Like if you wanted to travel from, say, Europe on to India, the main means was mostly you could use a vessel, that is a ship, to travel up to India, and that took several months to come to India. And similarly, if you look at the early 1900s, the transport and other mechanisms improved gradually. And today, in a few hours, you can reach from one part of the globe to another part of the globe. So what happens in this process is that globalization also gets encouraged. For example, if you want to transport your product from Chicago to Thiruvananthapuram, it is very easy now. You can just charter a flight, or if you do not have that much money, you can put it in the cargo of some flight, and in a few hours' time, you will reach, your product will reach Trivandrum. So, technology, and if you look at ICT, information and communication technology for that matter, you will find that services trade has become very easy because of improved ICT, or information and communication technology. For example, if you want to transfer data and all that, earlier you had to first of all transfer it to a USB or something of that sort. Then you will have to send it by post or something. Now, no longer that is required. Now you can use the internet, and immediately in the a matter of a few moments, you can transfer data from one part of the country to another, or one part of the world to another very easily. So that has resulted in a scenario where trade has increased in a mammoth fashion. For example, if you look at world trade as a proportion of output, in 1970s, it was only 10%. And if you look at 2022, the proportion increased to something like 52%. And if in between the corona hadn't interfered, then today we could have had trade to the extent of something like 65 to 70%. Similarly, if you look at foreign direct investment, in 2022, FDI was to the tune of nearly $1 trillion US, as against 400 billion in 1997. So you can see that with the expansion in technology and all that, FDI and trade has also increased in a massive manner. Similarly, the flow of capital. There are, in fact, if you look at the portfolio holdings in various countries, all put together, you will find that it is to the tune of 81 trillion in 2022. And in the same period, if you see, the currency transactions is to the tune of $7.5 trillion. So everything has increased massively, and all this has contributed to globalization in the economic sphere. Now, the main point of our discussion is globalization and the environment. Now, this is where all the problems do start. Now, globalization, as we know, has had tremendous impact on an environment. And this impact is always not in a very positive manner. And you all know much better than me. Now, this is a picture. See, the iron-based waste and similar other waste which has been produced by many of the developed countries are being dumped onto some of the developing countries without impunity. And this is the picture of one of the sites where such material has been dumped. And it is unfortunate that just because certain countries or certain sets of people have to consume more, you are degrading your environment in a way that it cannot be restored. Now, what has globalization actually done to the environment? If you look at it, it's very, very critical. And it is unfortunate that today this kind of scenario exists. One of the impact of globalization on environment, obviously, is climate change. There has been a huge increase in greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emission, nitrous oxide, CFCs, etc. And all this has invariably led to global warming. Now, the glaciers, they have started melting at an alarming rate. And it is expected that the sea levels will rise by nothing less than 96 centimeters by 2019. And what this implies is that many of the low-lying countries like Maldives, or even if you look at places in our country like Cochin or Chennai, they will definitely be submerged under the sea level. So that is something which is very, very hazardous and which needs to be taken into account very seriously. Similarly, if you look at the loss of biodiversity, that is huge. If I give you the statistics, you will be surprised that not even 10% of the original biodiversity that was existing on Earth is available today. And this is a very, very serious scenario which we have to take care of. Similarly, all this development has not meant that every person in the world is happy. The difference and the distinction between the haves and have-nots have also increased tremendously. So what we have is that the income differential between the top 5% of the society and the bottom 95% has increased to a very great extent. Today we have multimillionaires on one side, and on the other side we also have people who do not have anything to eat at all in many parts of the world. So for changing this kind of a scenario, you need governmental and other kinds of intervention. Now, the next aspect that we will deal with is free trade. Now, what has free trade meant for the environment? This is something that we have to definitely think about. Free trade is not something that will give a lot of pleasure to many people, because it has a downside which is very, very serious. Free trade basically means that it is trade without barriers. Now, more the trade, more the resource depletion and degradation of natural environment, because you are using more and more of resources to produce the goods and services, and this will lead to a lot of problem. More trade also means that there is increase in transport activity, because you are transporting the goods from one part of the world to another part of the world. Trade also reduces the incentives to develop environmental friendly technologies. More trade also means that agriculture reorganization to capture the economies of scale will, to a very large extent, be made possible by a larger market. And more trade increases negative externalities. Now, what do we mean by negative externalities? Negative externalities are, in fact, the result of production or consumption of a product, which results in a certain kind of cost or an expenditure to a third party. Suppose we have a industry right across our home or next to our home. Then what happens is that the emissions and other things coming out of that industry will affect us negatively. So we can say that the emissions of that industry is basically an negative externality for us. Okay, now let me ask you, do you have any doubts or any comments with regard to what I have discussed till now?
Sir, I have a small
Yeah,
clarification required.
please.
That is, on the impact side, we said global haves and have-nots, that disparity has increased.
Yeah.
Does it mean that without the globalization, it would have been much better?
No. What I meant was not that per se. What I meant was that, see, if you look at the kind of exploitation that has happened in the past 100 years, it has been huge. If um, uh, free trade and globalization per se is very good, if you leave it unhindered, but the problem arises when third agencies get into the process. And for example, if a multinational agency establishes its factory, say in a third world country in Africa, they will then exploit the labor and other factors to an extent that it benefits them, but not the residents of that country. So, if the natural production process of that country had been left untouched, maybe they would have been better off. And even if you look at India, in the 18th and 19th century, the British came in, destroyed our traditional industries just to ensure that their products are sold in India. Whereas when the British came in, we had 20 to 25% of the global GDP with us. And when they left, the fact is that we were left with 0.7% of the global GDP. So that is what I mean. And we will come to this very important point that you have discussed in a much broader manner during this discussion. I hope I have clarified myself.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Yeah, we will discuss that. Any other suggestion or question? Okay, then we will move ahead.
One more I can ask.
Yeah, please.
This globalization, whether it was a deliberate attempt to globalize or it happened organically. If it is an organical happening, nobody could have stopped it.
That's a very interesting observation, sir. It happened both ways. There was some natural globalization which was going on, people were exploring other parts of the world, products and culture from one part of the country, one part of the world was getting transferred to other parts. That was a natural process which was happening, and as you rightly said, no one could have done anything about it. However, some of the globalization was not natural. For example, the colonialism part. The British, for example, invaded many countries, captured their territories and resources, and then transferred their products onto those countries. So that was not natural. That was in the lookout for a market for their products. So that is quite different from the natural process of globalization, which organically takes place over the centuries, and that organic process was always there. Even if you look at the ancient period, the Romans and Indian civilization, they had an exchange of products, culture, and everything, and that was organic in nature. There was no colonialism of one kind of the other. But when you came to the 18th century, all this changed. And what we had in the 18th century was just the opposite. So you are absolutely right. There was an organic process which absolutely no one could have done away with. But of course, there was the other side where people were involving themselves in a process where they were forcefully putting elements of globalization into other countries. So shall we move ahead?
Yeah, please, please.
Yeah. So now when we come to this part, I have put the pictures of two eminent economists. One is towards the left is Mr. Dr. Raul Prabish, and on the right hand is Mr. H.W. Singer. They are known for a very important thesis in economics. This is basically called the Prabish-Singer thesis or the Brundtland hypothesis. What we say is that there could be a secular decline in terms of trade of developing and less developed countries. It means that if over a long period of time, the exports of developing and less developed countries will see a decline because they are basically exporting raw materials and such other things. And when the industrial processes change in the developed countries, these raw material and other things may not be required in the same proportion. So the terms of trade will definitely decline. So if the terms of trade decline, exporting countries must export more and more just to maintain the same foreign exchange earnings. For example, if you are looking at crop exports, then emphasis is then placed on expanding acreage and in order to increase export. And when you expand acreage, in the first case, you will be using the best land. Then you go to the second variety land. And the third process, you even cultivate barren land to increase your export. And that means the input cost is increasing. The best land can give you the best output by investing the least amount of money. The second best will cost you more, and the third best land will be, in fact, very, very costly and very difficult to cultivate. So that's what it means that over a long period of time, you will definitely experience a secular decline in terms of trade vis-a-vis the developing and less developed countries. Now, what do you mean by terms of trade? It is basically the ratio of export prices to import prices. So, if the export prices increase more than the import prices, a country has a positive terms of trade, and vice versa. Now, then we come to an important aspect, that is the aspect of environmental standards. Now, the problem here is that environmental standards are not uniform across the world. Certain countries impose very high levels of standards, and certain other countries impose pretty less levels of standards. So, it's a very divergent kind of situation where if you want to export something, you are expected to meet the environmental standards of the country which imports that product. So that's where the WTO comes in. WTO, in fact, works towards maintaining similar standards across the world so that an exporter does not find it difficult to export to any country. If the standards are different in different countries, then obviously the exporter will find it very difficult to export to certain sets of countries as against others. So these are basically environmental standards are basically set by the government, and this includes prohibition of certain activities, then a monitoring process. It sometimes requires permits for you to export certain goods and services, so on and so forth. Now, developing countries normally oppose these environmental standards. They say that trade sanctions do not directly address the root cause of environmental problems. Now, what is the root cause of environmental problems? That is, there is overproduction in developed countries, and for those that kind of overproduction and the deterioration that is taking place in developed countries, developing countries are asked to go in for higher environmental protection. They say developing countries therefore say that it is not at all fair. Then there are protectionist measures which reduce both income, both at home and abroad, especially in natural resource rich developing countries. Then there are environment linked trade sanctions, which will escalate trade disputes, resulting in retaliatory and counter retaliatory measures. And due to these three reasons, developing countries say that environmental standards will not solve the problem. Now, one of the environmental measures that normally is adopted by countries is labeling. Now, what happens is that when you, for example, if you want to export tuna to certain European countries, then your national agency is expected to give a label on that tuna that it is this tuna has been caught by using dolphin-friendly methods. So only if that label is there, that country would accept this product. Otherwise, it will be rejected. So that is one kind of environmental standard that is ensured by many countries. Now, there are regional problems also. For example, there is a question of transboundary pollution. Then there is a question, there is a problem like that of forest fires, acid rain, etc. And all these aspects need common management. So any action by one country that affects the global commons has an impact on other countries also. For example, if you have transboundary pollution, then it means that one country alone cannot save the situation. All countries have to work together, and then only this transboundary pollution can be solved. So that is what environmentalists say, that environmental problems do not stop at boundaries. They, in fact, have to be worked upon and solved in a consolidated manner. Now, the first international conference, in the strictest sense, dealing with human environment was the UN Conference on Human Environment, which was held in Stockholm in 1972. Now, this particular conference came out with 26 points, and these were all action points, and that is considered to be the first and most important conference on human environment and health. India was represented by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and she categorically stated that unless poverty is solved, you cannot have a solution for the difficulties that human environment is facing. Now, some of I haven't listed out all 26 points. Some of the important points were human rights. One of the focal points in this particular initiative was the emphasis on human rights. So the declaration stated that human rights must be asserted. At that time, you also had the system of colonialism and apartheid. In South Africa, there was a system called apartheid in which black Africans were discriminated against. So this conference, in fact, condemned apartheid also. Then it stated that natural resources must be safeguarded. Then it went on to say that its capacity to produce renewable energy must be maintained. Then pollution must not exceed environment's capacity to clean itself. Then it dealt with oceanic pollution and how it can be averted. Then it also stated that developing countries need more assistance, because all these years developed countries have been developing and developing countries have not been developing. So you need developing countries needed assistance to develop themselves. That was one of the points which was raised. Then they also stated that developing countries need money to develop environmental safeguards. And this was a point which was later on acted upon by the WTO itself. Now, there have been major environmental interventions on a global scale. So you have intergovernmental negotiations which have taken place on various aspects such as CFC and so on. Then you have national production and consumption controls which have come in. Then there have been initiatives to reduce energy intensive production methods. Then so there have been a lot of efforts, but the thing is that till now the kind of results that have been seen, that has not been very encouraging. Now, globalization also has had large-scale disruptions of ecosystem. Now, if you look at the deforestation rate, it was 0.52% between 1990 and 2000, or around 9.2 million hectares per year, which means that the deforestation was equivalent to an area which was equivalent to the size of Portugal. So you can imagine how large the extent of this thing deforestation would have been at that time. Now it has increased further. It has reached around 1% annually. So it means that it is almost double this extent. Nearly 20 million hectares of forest land is being denuded every year. Not only forest land, you also see that globalization has also resulted in coral reefs being lost due to bleaching, pollution, destructive fishing, and all that. And with the expansion of shipping, what has happened was that all the shipping waste are being dumped into the ocean at at many parts. And because of this, it has resulted in bleaching and pollution of the ocean beds, which has resulted in turn in the destruction of coral reefs as such. Now, all this has resulted in a phenomenon like El Nino becoming more intense. Even the kind of heat that we feel today in India, especially in Kerala, because I can say vouch for this. For the last many years, I haven't seen this intense kind of heat in Kerala. It is unbearable, and some of it is attributed to the El Nino effect. Now, El Nino has in fact harmed 16% of the world's coral reefs. 16%. That is huge. And three quarters of all fish stocks have been exploited beyond their sustainable limit. And that is also one of the effects of globalization, because these big, for example, if I tell you a specific example, these big trawlers from certain countries like China, they go on to the exclusive economic zones of other countries even and start fishing on a large scale. Even Indian fishing entrepreneurs, they are known to use the bottom trawlers, by which all the fish stocks, even the small fishes and fish eggs, get captured onto the trawlers, and the next generation of fishes do not come into existence at all. So we have seen that three quarters of all fish stocks across the world have been destroyed. Most of the environmental degradation, let me put it, is not due to poverty. For example, shifting cultivation and small farmers account for only a fraction of the depletion of forests, whereas industrial logging accounts to a vast majority of the denudation of forests that we see today. Another important thing is, this I was mentioning earlier also, the gene bank. The gene bank that we have today holds only 15% of the original genetic material which was available on Earth, which means that 85% of all genetic material is lost. And what that means is that tomorrow, if there are diseases to crops or humans, we will not have some genetic material which can be worked upon, and some solution can be found to these kinds of problems. The global environment cooperation experience has also been not very encouraging. It has been successful in those areas where cost of implementation has been less. But where the cost of implementation has been high, it has global environmental cooperation has not been very successful at all. Now let us take some of the examples of global environmental initiatives. One of the efforts that has made was the protection of the ozone layer. Now, ozone layer protection was one of the most successful of efforts, because one, those people who are affected most by ozone layer depletion were from the Western countries. One. And number two was the fact that ozone depleting substances were not critical to the production process, which means that there are easy substitutes available in the production process, because of which it was easy to implement, because majority of the production used to take place in the Western world at that time, and of course in China also. But since the Western citizens were getting affected more and more, they had an incentive to in fact work on this issue and get it to a normal level. So we had the Vienna Convention in 1985, which led to certain norms on the protection of ozone layer. Then in 1987, we had the Montreal Protocol, which imposed obligations on developed countries to reduce the use of ozone depleting substances. And the London Protocol was very important. And in fact, this protocol was to the Vienna Convention. And in this, it was agreed upon to cut CFC levels by 85% by 1997. In this case, the developed countries also agreed to take obligations with a grace period, and developed countries underwrote trust fund of US dollars $250 million to assess them. And this was one of the most successful initiatives as far as environmental protection is concerned. Now, then in 1992, we had the Rio Summit, about which I'm sure all of you are aware. And this summit was very, very significant because it was titled the Earth Summit. And here, human beings were kept at the center of concern as far as sustainable development was concerned. And here it was mentioned that there is a right to development, but in a sustainable way. People or countries shall not develop in such a manner that it will reduce the chances of future generations to sustain themselves. The major advantage of this Rio Summit was that it recognized the concept of differentiated responsibilities. Now, what do we mean by differentiated responsibilities? It means simply that the developed countries have been using all the world's resources for a long period of time, and the developing countries have been at the receiving end and have not been developing. So, the responsibility for sustainable development that falls on the developed countries is much, much higher than that which falls on the developing countries. So that is what is meant by differentiated responsibilities, and that was sought to be implemented in the Rio Summit. Then came the World Trade Organization. Now, in the World Trade Organization, we have a committee which is termed as the Trade and Environment Committee, and this is the committee which discusses environment and trade linkages. They go into what is the condition of the environment in the world and how trade is affecting the environment per se. Now, if you look outside the WTO also, you will find that of the 200 main international agreements that we have, 20 of them, in fact, deal with trade alone, which means around 10% of all the international agreement deal with trade. So, if you include a kind of environmental protection norm within the trade agreement, then it will work out better, because everyone is scared about trade. If you lose trade, then the country gets affected. So if you mix environment with trade, then definitely the impact on the countries will be much better. On the other hand, if you have a separate agreement which is not linked to trade, then how will we force the countries to implement those? That's a big question. So you have a large number of protocols in place, like the Montreal Protocol, which we have just discussed. Then you had the CITES agreement, that is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Then we have the Basel Convention on Trade or Transport of Hazardous Waste. So you have a number of agreements in which environment protection is included. Now, the WTO principles of non-discrimination and transparency do not conflict with trade measures needed to protect the environment, because where you have transparency and non-discrimination, automatically it is expected that environment will not get a raw deal. It will be taken care of. One of the most important agreements which deal with environment within the WTO is the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. Now, what does this sanitary and phytosanitary agreement deal with? It deals with quarantine and biosecurity measures, which are applied to protect human, animal, or plant health. And this is very, very important. And how does this risk arise? This risk arises from introduction, establishment, and spread of pests and diseases. And therefore, this agreement seeks to prevent such spread through various trade and non-trade measures. Now, one of the most important legal cases associated with the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement is the beef hormone case. Now, beef hormone case involved 6 hormones which were legally allowed in the United States of America to grow cattle, but these were banned in the European community. Now, you should understand this. According to American standards, these 6 hormones were allowed to be used to grow cattle. But in the European Union, it was stated categorically that these 6 hormones will not be used. So there was a big dispute. US wanted to export these cattle and beef from US to these countries, but the European community obviously objected to this, and it went to a GATT and later on a WTO panel. And the panel finding was that the European community violates certain articles of WTO, and also stated that measures taken were not based on risk assessment. Now, this is very important. Now, this is a very key finding because what the WTO stated was that when you impose a kind of restriction on trade involving, say, beef or any other living being, or meat for that matter, it should be based on scientific evidence. If you do not have scientific evidence, you just cannot go ahead and impose restrictions. And that came to handy even for countries like India. When we dealt with various other cases like tuna turtle case and all that, this principle was again and again used, and India and countries of the developing world gained a great deal from this kind of an interpretation. Now, another important initiative was the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Kyoto Protocol had a very ambitious kind of recommendation. They said that they will reduce emissions by 5.2% compared to 1990 levels by the year 2008-2012. But this did not happen. Industrial emissions did not fall by 5.2% of the 1990 levels, and it continued to increase even by 2008 and 12. Now, the funniest thing is that the United States of America refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol on the ground that the developing countries were exempted from the obligations. And this is very funny because US was, in fact, even now, it is the biggest polluter of the world. And if you have a big polluter like US moving out of the protocol just for on the ground that developing countries are being benefited and they are not given obligations, there is something wrong with the world system itself. Now, the developing countries demand that polluting north. The advanced countries are generally termed as north because they normally fall in the northern hemisphere. So the developing countries stated that the northern countries should pay the cost for cleaning up the environment, because for long periods the developing countries had suffered and the developed countries had enjoyed on the resources of the developing countries. Now, the protocol seeks to control emission of 6 gases, namely carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. So these are the 6 gases which were sought to be controlled by this protocol. And Article 17 of this protocol is very important. It allows countries that have emission, in fact, this protocol has a very interesting mechanism as well. It gave, based on the development levels of countries, it assigned carbon units to each country. And if you are good enough, then you will not use that many carbon units in a particular year. Whatever carbon units that is left over, that can be sold to another country, and in return you can get money. Therefore, what happens is that the developing countries, if they can reduce their carbon emissions, then the number of units that they use will be reduced, and these carbon units can actually be bought by some country which has money, and that will in fact benefit the developing country by providing them with more financial resources. This was in fact a kind of mechanism that was introduced, and they expected that the developed countries also will not buy too many carbon units because they are costly, and when they are costly, they will not go for large scale purchases, and overall the level of emissions will come down drastically. Now you have similar summits. One is the Paris Summit, and Paris Summit is important for the fact that the world community, in fact, stated that the global temperature increase will be limited to 2%, and efforts will be made to limit global temperature increase to 1.5% compared to pre-industrialized levels. Now that has not happened, and now, and as a result of that, even now we are seeing the high level of temperatures that we all have to face. Now, one important factor that was there in this kind of mechanism was the nationally determined contribution. So, under this Paris Climate Change Summit, it was mentioned that each country will decide how much CFC and other carbon products it will reduce voluntarily. There was no pressure on it, but each country was asked to determine by itself how much it will reduce the CFC or GSCs. And as a result, each country came out with a certain amount or a certain level that it said that it will voluntarily reduce. That was a great initiative, but many of the countries did not follow up on that. And because of that, even now, it has not succeeded a great deal. Another important mechanism that was suggested in this summit was to maintain sinks and reservoirs. What are sinks? For example, if you take the case of forests, forests have the ability to absorb a great deal of carbon. The forest can, in fact, absorb great deal of carbon by itself, and when they absorb these carbons, it acts as a sink. And this sink will, in fact, reduce the carbon intensity in the environment. So, countries have been asked to maintain a good extent of forests and other carbon reducing mechanisms, so that it acts as a reservoir and carbon which is put out to the environment are absorbed. So, it also called for the establishment of a green climate fund, and this green climate fund was expected to finance climate development processes, or the green climate fund was expected to finance projects which will prevent climate change. So this was a good, there was a lot of good intention in the Paris Climate Change Summit, but implementation is something that was not properly worked out. Again, there was this global environmental initiative that is in the form of the UN Climate Change Conference, or Conference of Parties 27, which was held at Sharm el Sheikh. I suppose it's in Egypt. In this particular initiative, a dedicated fund for loss and damage due to climate change was initiated. Secondly, even though the Paris conference enunciated the concept that there should be a 1.5%, 1.5 degrees Celsius maintenance of temperature rise compared to pre-industrialist level, this Sharm el Sheikh summit gave a clear roadmap as to how this has to be initiated. Then there was a focus on accountability of commitments. Earlier, what used to happen was that these countries used to accept certain obligations on themselves, but there was no accountability to ensure that this was actually maintained. Now, this summit stated that no, if you agree upon a certain aspect, you have to work towards ensuring that it is done. Then there was more of an effort on mobilizing financial funds during this COP27, and the focus was definitely on implementation of decisions taken during the current and previous Conference of Parties. Now, next we come to an important aspect, that is multinational corporations, transnational corporations, and developing countries. Now, this is very important. Why? Because majority of the trade that takes place today is either through multinational corporations or transnational corporations. And the kind of policies that these institutions undertake, they have a serious impact on developing countries. Now, if you take the case of MNCs and TNCs, these are in fact corporations that is registered and operates in more than one country at the same time. So, in fact, these institutions would be their units would be there in a large number of countries across the globe. Generally, the corporation has a headquarters in one country and operates wholly or partially through its subsidiaries in other countries. Now, I have also given a link which you can follow, and definitely that will be helpful to understand this distinction between MNCs and TNCs. MNCs, for that matter, are companies that operate in one or two countries with single ownership. That's the difference. It operates with a single ownership, whereas TNCs have operations in multiple countries and are mostly based on co-ownerships. That is, the same TNC can be in multiple countries, and in each country, the ownership will be different. So that's the biggest difference between an MNC and a TNC. Now, MNC, the operation of MNCs and TNCs has in fact led to the North-South divide. One of the major reasons that we see the North-South divide today is because of the operation of MNCs and TNCs. Now, as we see, the northern countries or the countries in the northern hemisphere are industrialized, whereas the countries in the southern hemisphere, they are mostly impoverished. According to the theory of globalization, free trade should result in free flow of goods, technology, capital, etc. But when it comes to actual practice, it is not free at all. The reality is that international trade has increased, but it has not resulted in either development, improving in the developing countries, or in the amelioration of poverty. Both these things have not taken place to the extent that it's desired. And whatever reduction in poverty, etc., has taken place, those have been due to the internal policies of the developing countries, including India. And globalization has not actually helped the reduction in poverty to a very great extent. Although exports of the South largely remain dependent on primary commodities, the share of manufactured goods is now increasing and improving greatly. Most of the poorest countries lack infrastructure to take advantage of the potential market opening. For example, if a country is good at producing primary products like fruits, if you don't have adequate storage capacity and adequate transport facility to move the products to the hinterland and then to the ports and to the developed countries, you cannot take advantage of the market openings in developed countries. By the time your fruit reaches the developed country, they will become stale. That is why even today, even though the developing countries have potential of export, many of them are not able to take advantage of the opportunities that those are there because of this big problem, that is lack of infrastructure. Similarly, large sections of the population lack access to productive assets and to healthcare and education. If you look at the healthcare and education condition in many of the developing countries, it is very, very bad. So that is, and if you do not have good health and good education, then production process will be affected and you cannot take benefit of the globalization process. Globalization, of course, has eroded national boundaries, but it has also increased problems greatly. Now, TNCs, that is the transnational corporations, have also been adding to the woes of these developing countries. Now, if you look at the TNCs, you will find that they are exploiting the raw materials and cheap labor of many of the developing and less developed countries. They produce their products and they give only small wage to these people whom they are exploiting, especially in the sub-Saharan African and other countries. Now, what is happening is that they sell these products at very high prices in foreign countries, but the benefit is only for the capitalists or the rich people who own the majority of the shares in these TNCs. And therefore, if you see, the foreign sales of the largest 100 TNCs form 25% of the world trade, and almost 2/3 of the total trade takes place within these countries. That is, the trade that actually takes place is not between countries as such today. It is between a unit of a TNC located in a developed country and a unit of a TNC located in a developing country. And these two trade with each other. So the benefit of that trade mostly goes to the transnational corporation only. Now, gradually we have seen that the TNCs are targeting many of the African countries for gene products. Now, the genetically modified products are very, very important today. Many of the plant varieties, many of the seed varieties, many of the agriculture products that we see today are all genetically modified. And one of the technologies that the multinational companies have introduced is that of the Terminator technology. And what does this Terminator technology mean? You can sow the seed that is bought from a TNC only once. Traditionally, what happens is that when we sow the seeds, the plant grows and it produces new seeds. The new seeds can again be sown and it will give us products further. But using the Terminator technology, what has happened is that the developed countries have ensured that the genetically modified product that is used by the poor farmers in developing countries, the seeds cannot be sown again. It can only be sown once. And once that is sown, for the next production cycle, they have to approach these multinational corporations or the TNCs and buy new seeds, and then they have to sow it once again. So the Terminator technology is one of the examples where the gene products have been misused. So the African countries are now resisting moves to bring in genetically modified products into their country. And now one of the important treaties that has been in existence in this field is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an output of the Rio 1992. And there it is mentioned clearly that the benefit of the genetic product should be equally distributed, and such technologies as the Terminator technology should not be introduced on any product whatsoever. Now, the role of the international financial institutions is also very important. Now, if you look at any of the financial institutions, we have a number of financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, so on and so forth. Now, if you take it, the IMF and the World Bank per se, you will see that when they lend the money to another country, they have certain conditionalities. And a few of the economists call these conditionalities as the Washington Consensus also. Now, what are these conditionalities? These conditionalities are imposed on the borrowing country, and they are expected to follow certain structural adjustment policies. For example, they have to reduce their expenditure, the fiscal deficit has to be reduced, the budgetary deficit has to be reduced. Further, they are also expected to go ahead and in most cases go in for devaluation of their currency. Why is devaluation important? Devaluation of the currency is important because it makes their trade price competitive. When you devalue your currency, then your product becomes cheaper in comparison to the foreign products, and you can compete much more effectively in the foreign markets, which will give you more foreign exchange earnings. So that is the simple logic behind devaluation of the currency. So in the case of IMF and the World Bank, the advocacy has been backed by loan conditions which require countries to reduce their trade barriers as well. So partly as a result of these loan conditions, poor countries are now opening up their economies rapidly. Of course, if you open up your economy in a gradual manner, it is okay. But if you open up your economy in a very violent and very fast manner, then you will face a lot of difficulties and there will be economic instability. Now, due to this, and other factors, and even against the multinational companies, there has been civil action by the local populations in many of the countries. Now, what is civil regulation? It means it is a term that is used to describe the broad range of strategies increasingly adopted by the civil society organization aimed at holding companies accountable for their environmental responsibilities. In Kerala also, we had the Plachimada incident, where underground water was poisoned. There was some poisonous substance. Plus, we also had a situation where underground water was not available for local use due to the activities, industrial activities. So, in African countries also, where such problems arise, there has been efforts to actually hold the companies which were responsible for these kind of environmental degradation accountable, so that they do not enter into these activities again and again. And in the case of Nigeria, there was a big oil well, and thousands of Nigerian villagers, including women and children, they crowd that area, and they shut 90,000 barrels of oil production a day over a job dispute. And the multinational company was forced to negotiate with these people, and their terms and conditions were accepted. So you have a number of such civil action coming up again and again. So in India also, if you take the case, there are a number of issues on which this civil action has taken place. Even in the case of Bhopal tragedy, there was a class suit which was filed in the Supreme Court, because of which there was some justice that was done to the victims of Bhopal gas tragedy, even though it was not sufficient. Now, there are technological concerns also, which are very, very important. Now, there are no technology at present which is 100% pollution free. For example, if you take even the case of these electric vehicles that we have today, their batteries are polluting in nature. So, after 5 or 7 years, when the battery becomes useless, what do you do with those electric batteries? That is one of the concerns that we have today. So, at present, we find very few technologies which are pollution free. The conventional technologies are basically based on energy intensive methods of production. And those are basically driven by non-renewable resources like fossil fuels. There are alternative technologies like solar energy, etc., but these are still very costly for the common man. Now, the government of India is also promoting solar energy through the Solar Alliance and mechanisms like that. But still, a lot of work needs to be done in this case. A special word of caution needs to be mentioned about the metals, chemical, and pharmaceutical industries. These are basically termed as a dirty industry because the cost of treatment of the waste put out by these industries is pretty high. So that is why they are called the dirty industries, and they pollute the environment to a great extent. And even now, technologies have not come out to a very great extent which can completely eliminate pollution in these industries. Now, that is where the concept of environmental standards become important. Now, when we talk about environmental standards, there are two kinds of standards. One is the ambient standard, and the second one is the emission standard. Ambient standards are those which deal with the minimum allowable level of pollution. That is, if a government sets an ambient standard, you cannot pollute beyond that level. And any industry or any concern which pollutes beyond that level will be penalized. Now, emission standards may be established in terms of what can be achieved with the available technology, or in terms of the impact of emission. So, emission standards are quite different from that. So, emission standards basically are established in terms of what the current level of technology can achieve in terms of reduction of pollution. So, developing country products cannot be competitive if they are forced to abide by high international standards, and that's a major problem. And that's why many of the developing countries insist that the Western standards which are imposed with regard to environment are too high. And if such high standards are established, then their products will not be accepted in those countries, and then there will be a great deal of problem for the developing countries as such. Now, the TNCs and MNCs, they are one of the major, they are the major polluters as far as the greenhouse gases are concerned. If you take the case of mining industry, and most of the mining industry is today managed by MNCs or TNCs. 6 companies control 63% of the mining capacity. And mining is one of the most polluting industries that we have. In agriculture, if you see, the TNCs and MNCs control 80% of the worldwide cultivated land for exports. And 20% of these firms account for 90% of the pesticide sales that we have. So what we find is that MNCs are polluting the environment in a massive manner. And not only this, the MNCs exploit natural resources and also degrade forests for their benefit. And as a result of that, the environment is suffering a great deal due to these MNCs. So what are the reasons that the environment is getting degraded? One is the lack of global political will. Even though lip service is paid for protecting the environment, even today we do not have a concrete mechanism whereby environment can be can be protected. And of course, there are countries like India are making great deal of effort, but the Western countries are not, in fact, putting in enough financial resources into the process of environmental protection. So, as a result, concepts like equity, equality, justice, democracy are all ignored. Then, secondly, there is no transparent mechanism to integrate economic and ecological globalization. Nations look at self-interest and not at global interest. Now, the Western countries or any country for that matter across the globe, they are looking more and more at self-interest and not at the global interest. And that is a major cause for concern as well. Now, global environmental negotiations are now turning into business negotiations because behind every government, their business concerns are exerting a lot of pressure. And because of this, if you look at any global environmental negotiation process, you will feel that it is basically a kind of business negotiation. So what happens as a result is that societal costs are ignored and government systems are built on the which should be built on the principles of democracy, justice, and equality. They are all ignored at the same time. So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to tell you about this first part of my presentation. If you have any points to discuss, kindly come forth. We can have a discussion as well. Yes, please, if you have any doubts or any points to ask or any suggestions to make, kindly do.
Sir, just one doubt only. The further sessions scheduled on the coming days will be the same or it will be different?
No, those are different parts. This is the first part of that. There are 5 different parts of this particular paper.
Okay,
Each
fine.
part will be dealt with in each of those days.
Okay, good.
It will be different in each day.
Yeah, fine. Thank you, sir. So that we can have a clear idea.
Yeah, it is all going to be different. It will all be different. It's not going to be the same. There will be no repetition of this.
Okay, fine. Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Thank you.
Sir, here
Please.
the concerns are expressed by everybody on a global basis also. Everybody talks. And everybody is knowing what are all the implications if it is not done, what is going to be in the future, etc. about sustainability.
Exactly.
But There is no statutory system for implementation, isn't it? It is
Yeah,
more of a voluntary imposition.
exactly, exactly.
And yes,
Yes,
and
please, please
as
go
you
ahead.
have pointed out, sir, nations will have its own interest, mostly of economic and political interest, rather than anything concerning with the environment.
Very right.
So here, at least I think that the civil organizations, civil bodies, etc., they have to put up the resistance for implementation to a greater extent. But that is also very few of them are globalized.
Exactly. But my feeling is that within each country, if the civil society actively works in this direction, then definitely this can be solved.
Yes.
Even if you look at many of the NGOs, they also have their own vested interests. That is one of the problems that we are facing.
Also,
And
the
I cannot
institutions
tell
are
you what
also
it is. Yes, yes, please.
also the institutions are also working because since the ESG score and all is nowadays it's become so important now. So
Exactly.
institutions are working on that one.
Yeah, that is the problem. For example, if you see, there was a news item, I think, a couple of days back. In a certain area in Kerala, illegally, it seems the officials as well as the traders were colluding with each other and they were cutting out forest land. So, such a situation can be prevented only by civil action when the local communities get involved into
Right,
that process and solve it. So, what Unitan sir says is absolutely right. There is a weak implementation process, and this weak implementation process has resulted in much of the problem. And if you have noticed, two important agreements, one is the Paris Agreement and one is the Kyoto Protocol. In these two agreements, USA is not a part. One
Yeah.
of the biggest polluter of the world, USA, does not want to become a part of these two very important initiatives. Then how will it work out?
And that is the main problem, sir. But the silver line is at least the awareness is catching up. Questions are being raised. Resistances are being put up, even at a local level also. So I don't think everything is lost.
Yeah, hopefully, because the kind of temperature increase and all that we are seeing recently, if it
Yes.
goes on this way, in 5 years' time, I do not know what will be the condition.
No, that is really it is a concern, and it will
Exactly.
endanger even the life of plants, the environment,
Everywhere.
everything.
Yeah.
Everything. And the water table depletion is a very, very matter of serious concern.
Exactly. Very
That
true.
Bangalore, now what we see about Bangalore and most parts of Kerala also, it is also
Very
there in
right.
the paper today.
Exactly. Exactly. That is true. And it's going to be very bad from now on.
Yes.
It's not going to improve any soon.
No, it cannot because that is the damage we are doing for. That is the cost of development, perhaps.
Exactly. But that is unplanned development. If it had been
Yes.
planned and properly implemented, this kind of a scenario would not have
It
arisen.
would not have. It would not have.
So there is one more short part to this presentation. Shall I take it now?
Yes.
Uh, okay.
For me, it is okay, sir. But about
Yeah.
others,
Yeah, it's
Others,
okay for me also. Yeah, it's okay for me also.
pardon me.
It's okay for me also, sir.
Okay, fine. This is a short presentation because it's part of the same block. So we'll have to come back and do it
yeah.
again. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yeah. So in this particular presentation, we are going to deal with uh, natural calamities, and that's why it's very simple. So we will be basically talking about earthquakes, floods, cyclones, tsunamis, drought, and preparedness for meeting these calamities. Now, natural calamities, we all know what it is. An environmental calamity is an event that causes damage, economic disruption, loss of human life, deterioration in health and health services in a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from the affected community or from outside. So this is what is important. On a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response. That is the key point which distinguishes a calamity from a local natural incident. If the scale is of such a nature that the people within the community cannot deal with the problem that has arisen and help is required from outside the community, then you call it a natural calamity. Now, there are various types of natural calamities. We all know about that. One is atmospheric, that is basically dealing with rain, hailstorms, winds, lightning, etc. Then you have hydrological, related with water, like floods, glacier advances, water logging, etc. Then you have geological, like landslides, avalanche, earthquake, volcano, shifting of sands, etc. Then you have biological, which is more in the nature of severe epidemics that we see in humans, plants, or animals. Then you have forest fires, pest invasion, etc. So these are the four basic types of calamities: atmospheric, hydrological, geological, and biological. Now, this map is pretty important because if you see the red zone that is indicated here, that shows the areas which are most affected by natural calamities and global hazards by which are measured by mortality risk distribution. Just see, in India, there are many parts which are in the red zone, which means these are the areas where there will be multiple hazards. There is a likelihood of multiple hazards, and the death toll is likely to be very high. Apart from India, you have Africa, where major part of the African continent is in the red zone. Similarly, you have Japan and such other areas because there you have volcanic eruption and earthquakes coming off and on. And where you do not have such a scenario, their wars and other things are making life very difficult, as in the case of Russia and all that. Russia, etc., is are on a very safe zone, but man-made calamities such as Ukraine war and other things are making things very difficult in that area. Now, here much of my focus will be on Africa because Africa is a continent which has had a major share of natural calamities. If you look at drought per se, many countries like Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia, Kenya, etc., have been affected by droughts. Tropical storms, if you look at them, you have countries affected like Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, etc. Similarly, if you look at floods, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, etc., are gravely affected. And earthquake, if you see, Sudan, Guinea, etc., are the country which have been mostly affected by earthquakes. Now, first we will start with earthquakes. We all know that earthquakes are basically vibration of the earth produced by the release of energy. And once this energy is released, it radiates in all directions from its source. Earthquakes can occur because of man-made reasons also, like a nuclear explosion, etc. Then large reservoirs of hydrostatic pressure of water may also induce earthquake. Then one of the major reasons for earthquake is basically plate tectonics, where across the fault lines, cracks in earth crust cause, in fact, earthquakes because the tectonic plates meet at these points and earthquakes are formed. Then if you look at the seismic zones, that is the likelihood of earthquakes. The highest seismic zone is, of course, zone 5. This is the most serious of seismic zones. And here there is likely to be very high damage. Zone 4 is known as the high damage risk zone. Zone 3 is basically termed as the moderate damage risk zone. Zone 2 is the low damage risk zone. And zone 1 is basically very low damage risk zone. Now, the measures. How do you measure earthquakes? there are two basic scales. One is the Rossi and the Forel scale, which has 10 divisions. So the higher the number on the scale, the greater will be the damage which is caused. Then you have the Mercalli scale or the Richter scale, which is more popular. This describes the amplitude of the earthquake wave radiating out in all directions from the epicenter or the focus, which is closely related to the amount of energy released. This is also a measure of ground motion as recorded on seismograph. So if you look at the earthquakes in India, one of the major earthquakes was in Bhuj in 2001, if you remember correctly. Not less than 348,000 buildings were destroyed in this earthquake. Around 16 million people were affected. 20,000 cattle were killed, and the economic loss was between 1.3 to 5 billion US dollars. So a major earthquake by any standards. Then you have other natural calamities like floods, cyclones, tsunamis, etc. Of course, we know that flood is a discharge of water that exceeds the canal capacity of a river. It results in loss of life and massive displacement. Floods are also caused by other factors. For example, extreme climate changes like heavy and prolonged rainfall. Then melting of heavy snow can cause floods. Collapse of dams can cause it. Then landslides can cause it. Then silting of riverbeds, reducing the carrying capacity of rivers, can also be a cause for floods. And this is a major reason for floods in many states in the country. Finally, the lack of coordination between officials of adjoining districts or states can cause similar problems. And that is also very true. Often when flood happens, there is a lack of coordination between officials of one state and the other. And this intensifies the extent to which the flood causes problems. If we look at the African case, there was a major African flood in 2007. And this caused death to the extent of 64 persons in Sudan, 17 in Ethiopia, Uganda, there were 21 deaths, Rwanda, there were 18 deaths, Burkina Faso, 31, Kenya, 12, Togo, 20. See, a single flood is affecting how many nations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 states majorly were affected by a single flood. So you can see the intensity of that flood. And in Ethiopia alone, 4,500 people were displaced, and in Uganda, 150,000 people were displaced. Infrastructure loss was also very heavy in these floods. Uganda lost around 170 schools. Rwanda, 500 houses were destroyed. Mali, you had the destruction of 5 bridges and 250 residences. When we say that 5 bridges were destroyed, these bridges were the mainstay of Mali, the biggest bridges in Mali, and those were all destroyed in this kind of flood. So what were the reasons for this kind of a calamity? One was that there was an absence of proper town planning in these countries. Again, the second major reason was that inter-country coordination was very limited. And this absence of planned development in these countries resulted in heightening the intensity of floods in these countries. Now, what are the solutions that we have for flood redemption? One is you can build definitely dams and reservoirs. Then you can strengthen embankments. Then you can improve the carrying capacity of rivers by desilting and deepening these rivers. Then you can widen the channels of the canals. Then you can in fact channel the flood waters from one river into channels or other canals where they cause less problems. Then you can have floodplain management techniques in place, and you can prepare natural ponds, reservoirs, etc., so that the intensity of the flood is reduced. Another major calamity is definitely cyclone, and we all know that cyclone are found in the tropical belt, where the seawater gets heated up to 27 degrees Celsius. And this causes low pressure areas, and the low pressure areas remain stationary for 3 or 4 days, and they draw energy from the sea surface. As the pressure in the center falls, the wind speed increases and the cloudburst occurs, apart from the spiraling of wind all around that place. And as the pressure falls, the center, the winds in the surrounding areas rush inward, creating a spiral movement. And this is what is called basically the cyclone. So cyclones are also a major calamity in many parts of the world, including in India. And one of the factors that again increases the problem related to cyclone is the lack of coordination among different agencies, and this results in a great deal of problem as far as managing cyclones is concerned. Now, one of the major cyclones that we find to have occurred is the Idai cyclone of 2019. Now, the countries which are affected were Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, etc. 1,500 deaths were reported and 2,000 persons were found missing. The cyclone speeds ranged from 195 kilometers to around 210 kilometers. As a result of those cyclones, there was flooding in Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi, and as the aftermath of this cyclone, around 4,000 people were affected by cholera. See, a single instance of cyclone can cause all this. So that's why proper cyclone planning is essential. And one of the countries greatly affected by cyclones used to be Bangladesh. Now, another major calamity is that of tsunami. And we all know that tsunami is a wave in the ocean or in a lake that is created by a geological event, such as having an earthquake. Now, most tsunamis, for that matter, are very weak. So we do not feel any problem with due to those tsunamis. However, the larger tsunamis are a major risk. And these tsunamis rise up to 30 to 70 feet. So most of the tsunamis are caused by earthquakes and landslides, and volcanic eruptions can also cause tsunamis. So in India also there was a major tsunami and a lot of people were affected by this, and this was the tsunami of 2004. And in this tsunami, the major countries affected were Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Thailand, and Kerala was also very badly affected by this tsunami. And if you look at it, during the tsunami, waves of up to 50 meters or 50 feet were witnessed, and an earthquake of the magnitude of 9 on the Richter scale. Anything above 6 is considered to be dangerous, and here we have a earthquake of the magnitude of 9 on the Richter scale, and that was seen off the coast of Sumatra, and this basically caused this kind of a tsunami. For it, the extent of the tsunami was to the range of 4,500 kilometers west of this epicenter. Around 80,000 people were killed in the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia, 41,000 in Sri Lanka, 10,000 in India, and 4,000 in Thailand. Now, in the African coast also, many countries were affected. The tsunami killed 10 in Tanzania, 1 in Seychelles, 1 in Kenya, and tsunamis caused damages in Madagascar and Mauritius as well. So it was a major event resulting in huge loss of life and property in 2004. So droughts. Next, we can come to droughts. Droughts are usually caused by dry spells, lack of rainfall, etc. And you have to make a distinction between a dry climate and droughts. It differs from dry climate, which is usually associated with a region that is normally or seasonally dry. The impact of drought affects the developing countries more intensively than developed countries because the coping mechanism is much lesser in developing countries. Now, droughts can be of 3 types. One is the meteorological droughts, which are caused by deficient rainfall. Then you have the hydrological drought, which is caused by lack of river flow. And third is the agriculture drought, which is caused basically due to the loss of soil moisture. Now, it can be caused due to climatic factors. It can also be caused due to felling of trees for firewood, denudation of forests for agriculture purposes, mining, etc. And it can also be caused by global developmental policies, which may result in an increase in temperature, resulting in droughts. Now, droughts have major economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact, and these are all self-explanatory. No explanation is required, and it is very clear to everyone. Now, there have been certain drought mitigation strategies in Africa. You can read about that when I circulate the PPT at the end of my fourth session. After that, all the PPTs with reference to all these sessions will be provided to you. So please wait till that, and you can read through these drought mitigation strategies which are adopted in Africa, and these are very successful today. You can go through this, and these are very interesting as well. Then disaster preparedness. This is very, very important. Disasters mostly cause emergencies, and for meeting emergencies, the overall capacity of the country to manage such emergencies is very important. So there are four phases in which an emergency or a disaster can be managed. One is the pre-planning stage. This occurs basically before a disaster actually takes place, much before that. And this includes the construction of defensive engineering works, land use planning, dissemination and maintenance of evacuation plan, etc. Preparedness is the second stage, which reflects the degree of alertness immediately before the occurrence of a calamity. This includes provision of emergency warnings to people, availability and maintenance of hospitals and such other things where people can be immediately evacuated just after a calamity strikes. Then response is how you respond to a calamity immediately before and after the occurrence of a calamity. And fourth phase is very important, that is recovery and reconstruction. Because once a calamity takes place, there will be large-scale destruction of life and property. And here, the recovery and reconstruction process has to be in such a manner that even if a future calamity occurs, the scale of destruction, the scale of loss of life will be at a minimum. So this is in a short what I had to state in this session. So if you have any doubts or anything to be discussed, kindly come forward. You are welcome to present your views. Yes, Nitin, sir.
Sir, maybe I have a doubt, but that is not related to the topic now we have discussed. It is related to assignments. Can I ask?
Fine. Yeah, please do.
So in many of these are all general topics.
Yeah.
A restriction of number of words may not be possible in some cases, but in many of the assignments, they say up to 5 marks, 250 words, beyond that, 500 words, etc. In an examination, it is okay, understood. But in an assignment, we read as much as possible, we prepare it is the basis of our understanding because the study material is so compact and comprehensive. So many a time it may not be possible to restrict strictly to those word limits, whether it is a negative side in that case.
No. In fact, these word limits are indicative in nature.
Okay.
The only thing is that it should not exceed too much. For example, if you are a 250 word question, you cannot write something like 1,500 words. It is generally indicated, but for a 250 word question, there is no harm in going up to maybe 400 or 500 words.
Yeah. Many times it will be required. That's
yeah, I understand that. No one will penalize you for that. The only thing is that it should not be such an elaborate answer that the evaluator just falls off. That should not be the case.
Understood, sir.
Yeah, that's the case. Otherwise, it's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, do we have assignments for PGDESD?
Pardon me?
Do we have assignments for this postgrad?
Yeah, it is there and it is available on the website.
Okay, fine.
On the
Okay.
IGNOU website, there is a link student zone.
Okay.
Student zone and download those assignments. So
Fine. Okay. So, is there any deadline date for submission?
Deadline is there. You are from the January 2023.
Right.
batch
Right.
now.
Yeah.
So you have sufficient time. The dates are normally mentioned on the assignment itself.
Fine.
You
Fine.
can follow those dates.
Okay. Okay, sir.
So absolutely no problem. You have
Thank you.
more than ample time to deal with it.
Okay.
So if you do not have any further doubts or comments to make, we will call it a day. I thank all of you for joining this session, and I hope that you will be there for the next session and the forthcoming sessions as well.
Sure, sir.
So
Thank you
it was
so
a
much.
nice session.
It was
Yeah,
interesting listening to, and especially for me, after so many years listening to a classroom type experience, it was really good.
It is absolutely my pleasure. And again and again, when you come on to the counseling sessions, it will give me greater inspiration to come forth with further counseling sessions as well. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
thank you all of
Thank you,
you
sir.
for
Thank you
joining.
so much.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and we'll all meet next Tuesday, I suppose.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Thank you.
ഇല്ല